I'd like to spend a few episodes on the Roman military machine. And I want to explore how this force-fueled expansion secured borders and bolstered the emperor's power. Today, I want to explore a few questions. How large was the Roman military? How much did it cost? I also want to think about why Rome has a military in the first place, especially under the emperors, and the role that soldiers played in both receiving imperial ideology, but also in creating it. We're going to get started on the Roman military on today's episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 44, The Roman Military, Part 1. The Romans portrayed themselves as militarily powerful, but also judicious. In reality, when dealing with foreign peoples, aggression and expansion was often the first option. In many cases, the use of military force for the Romans was driven by immediate problems and not necessarily long-term planning. Now, there are those scholars that think that the Romans had a kind of grand strategy that spanned multiple generations for accumulating and then pacifying and ultimately unifying an empire. And there are certainly moments when we see those impulses explicitly in the plans of emperors and military leaders. But more often than not, I don't see much of a central or grand strategy. The Romans deployed their military often to solve local problems in particular places. They waged targeted wars to punish rebels or to pacify peoples whom they wanted to control and exploit. And as we've seen so far in this podcast, especially as we've gotten past the midway point of the Pax Romana, the military has pivoted to more of a security role, where soldiers protect the periphery provinces from invasion, rather than being deployed as the vanguard of an expansionary vision for the Roman Empire. It was also the military's role to uphold the power and the reputation of the reigning emperor. Troops and citizens, soldiers and non-soldiers, were indoctrinated in a highly personalized imperial ideology. They swore personal oaths to the emperor. They carried around his image. The coins in their pockets, which came to them in the form of salary payments and bonuses, bore the image of the emperor on them. He was at the very center of military life, even for soldiers that never saw him in person. And for the soldiers, their part in imperial ideology was a participatory one, because the military victories achieved in the name of the emperor were signs of the gods' approval. And so the soldiers were, whether they fully understood it or not, the means by which the gods signaled their approval of the emperor. And so, funnily enough, despite the fact that the emperor was nominally in charge of the Roman Empire, it was, practically speaking, the military and their efforts that gave him legitimacy. And this was not lost on the soldiers, especially military leaders early on. For example, we saw in episode 9, on the death of Rome's first emperor, Augustus, Roman legions committing acts of mutiny and suggesting to at least one man that they might make him emperor instead of the one that Augustus had decided. That happens because the military are aware that they are not simply passive recipients of imperial ideology. They are emperor makers. But with the support of the soldiers, emperors enjoyed a monopoly on military power. Roman emperors were therefore very careful about who they allowed to engage in campaigning, who was placed in charge of armies. It couldn't just be anyone. At the same time, Roman emperors could not simply leave Rome whenever they wanted to go on campaigns themselves, because they risk usurpation back in the city of Rome. So military loyalty was crucial, both to ensure that the legions on the borders of the Roman Empire would stay loyal when the emperor was not there and his generals were, but also that the legions in Rome would stay loyal to the emperor when he decided that he wanted to lead a campaign far away from the capital. Hence the constant inculcation in the personality cult of the emperor among the soldiers. Each emperor handled this problem differently, and we've seen multiple examples, whether like Trajan in episode 29 and 30, who led his soldiers personally in wars of Roman expansion, or emperors like Vespasian, who in episode 23 and episode 25 left his soldiers in Judea to go and take Rome from the weak emperors that were ruling it at the time. But during the Pax Romana, emperors were, for the most part, securely in charge of their soldiers. And so really then the question became how to pay for such a large military. And the Roman military was huge. Probably by the middle of the 2nd century, we're talking perhaps 150 to 200,000 citizen legionaries, men with Roman citizenship serving in the military full-time on a professional basis. These are not conscripts, but paid professional soldiers. They are not working fields. They are not farming. They are not engaged in crafts. They are not engaged in trade, but they're garrisoned in forts or on active duty in some capacity. Now, you might as well double that number because another 150 to 200,000 men were serving as auxiliaries in the Roman military. These are non-citizen soldiers. In many cases, these were conscripts who, by means of treaty or conquest, whether recently or in the distant past, became themselves a kind of permanent part of the Roman military, acting in support of the legionaries. So already we could be around 300 to 400,000 soldiers. And then there were the Praetorian Guardsmen. And if you want to know more about the Praetorian Guard, I go into a little bit more detail at the beginning of episode 10. So after this episode, you can check that out. There were about 10,000 of those men, the personal household soldiers of the emperor, his kind of bodyguard. But even after just a few emperors, they were much more than that. Rome also had a navy. We don't know how many soldiers were involved in the navy, but it was tens of thousands, perhaps 20,000 or 30,000 men. We don't really have exact figures, but close to 500,000 men served in some capacity in the Roman military. Now, as I said a moment ago, how on earth do you pay the salaries of so many men? And while we don't have budget figures for the Roman military, historians have made some pretty good guesses, in my opinion, led by an ancient historian who was at Cambridge, Richard Duncan Jones. And you can check out his book. It's a few years old, but it is still very relevant. Money and Government in the Roman Empire, published by Cambridge University Press. Richard Duncan Jones gave a few estimates for how much money went towards the military and he guessed that around 3/4 of all government spending went to the military. This would be not out of step with many other pre-industrial empires like the Ottoman Empire or the military budget of Elizabethan England, for example, with the remaining quarter of the budget going to things like paying for civilian employees, handouts of various kind to citizens in Rome and perhaps other cities, and then building projects, and then just a variety of other kinds of spending that we don't really have neat categories for. And again, these are just estimates. We don't have hard data for it, but the number had to be high, and these numbers seem plausible to me. When Augustus became emperor, and you might remember he is the very first Roman emperor, and so much precedent is set by what he did, Augustus decided to separate out a military treasury to guarantee that there were funds available to pay for so many soldiers. And Augustus discharged half the soldiers, so he didn't even have the same size of military that we would see in the middle of the 2nd century, but even he felt the need to have a guaranteed fund for his soldiers. A soldier during the time of Augustus made a moderate salary. It was not a lot, but it was more than enough to live on, roughly 900 sesterces a year for each citizen legionary. It was paid in 3 installments, denominated in gold, but likely passed out in smaller change, and most soldiers probably did not take all of their money when they were paid. They kept it in an account with the military. And that salary figure established under Augustus basically stayed the same for around 100 years until the reign of Domitian, who gave the soldiers a 33% increase, bumping up their annual salary to 1,200 sesterces a year. Now that's the legionaries, and we can track their salary figures reasonably well throughout the entirety of the Pax Romana. We know less about what the praetorians were made. We guess that they made a little bit more. We also don't know what the auxiliaries, the non-citizen soldiers, made, but we guess it was a little bit less. Now, as I said, this is a modest salary based on what we know of other wages and prices in the Roman Empire, but the soldiers did not get it all free and clear. They were expected to pay for their own weapons and gear and supplies, at least in the 1st century of the Pax Romana. Sometime in the 2nd century, emperors decided to also fund the weapons and gear of soldiers. Sometimes soldiers had to take out loans. We have documents from the Pax Romana period detailing, for example, a cavalryman named Lucius Secundus taking a loan of 200 silver coins so that he could make ends meet until he was next paid. Yes, the Romans had payday loans, and soldiers at least had to take them at times. So between daily expenses that they just needed themselves, the cost of their gear, I imagine Roman soldiers were not able to save too much, but they were also given a retirement plan which helped compensate for their otherwise pretty unimpressive salary. Back in the Roman Republic, soldiers were given land, but by the time of Augustus, this practice had largely stopped, and instead soldiers were given a cash payment when they retired. And it was worth about 15 years or so of salary, 12,000 sesterces in a cash bonus lump sum at the end of their 20 to 25 years of service. Now, as I said, initially this all came out of Augustus's special military treasury, which he set up through a large personal donation. And then after him, it was funded through regular taxes and very quickly began to fail. During the Pax Romana, soldier salaries were almost never increased as a result. Now, fortunately for them, inflation generally was also pretty low during this time, so it didn't matter that they weren't getting regular pay rises, but emperors still often wanted to secure the loyalty of their soldiers, and so they increasingly turned to extra bonuses that they handed out on various occasions. Really, they just found excuses to give money to the military to ensure goodwill. When they became emperor, they passed out money. On their birthdays, they passed out money. On the birthdays of their family members, they passed out money. On certain key anniversaries, before wars, after wars, during triumphal parades, sometimes just for no reason at all, they just passed out a bonus to soldiers. Now, Richard Duncan Jones, in his book, catalogs these bonuses. And just to give you a sense of the difference, Augustus passed out something like 18 million sesterces worth of bonuses, both to soldiers and citizens. Trajan, however, bumped this up to 24 million sesterces, and Hadrian almost doubled that at 44 million sesterces. Now, we don't get into the reigns of emperors in the 3rd century on this podcast. At least that's not necessarily my plan. If folks are still interested by the time we get to it, I guess we could still keep going. But some of those emperors, like Caracalla, for example, handed out 140 million sesterces worth of bonuses to soldiers and citizens, and he only reigned a few years. So this kind of spending quickly got out of control. A soldier ultimately was able to live on the money that he received, but he was not so well off that he did not want more. And I think that's the point I want to drive home by all of this. During the Pax Romana, the military was well paid and yet, at the same time, unsatisfied. And the increasing amount of bonuses that were paid created a culture of entitlement among Roman soldiers, such that the Praetorian Guard, for example, was unashamed after murdering the third emperor Caligula to ask explicitly for a bonus to save the life of Claudius and promote him to emperor in the violent aftermath of that assassination. We know quite a lot about military pay and life because the Romans kept detailed records, and many of these survive, some of which survive either as papyrus documents or inscriptions, or in some cases wax tablets that we find in the western part of the Roman Empire. What did the soldiers give up in order to receive regular pay and a steady career? Well, perhaps most importantly, they were not allowed to legally marry. And if a soldier was married prior to joining the legions, he had to dissolve his marriage before serving. Any children he had or would have with an illegitimate wife were themselves illegitimate. They could not inherit from him and did not legally have his name. Soldiers were initially not allowed to own land in the provinces where they served, but of course Hadrian changed that. Soldiers received a variety of other benefits. They could not be prosecuted in standard civil courts. Instead, they were tried for their crimes in the military camp instead of where the crime took place. This was a huge advantage for soldiers, obviously, to be tried essentially by their peers and commanders. Once they retired, military veterans were exempt from taxation. They were exempt from compulsory services. These are called liturgies, by the way. They also did not have to billet soldiers in their house, which many people did in the Roman Empire. And over time, so you know a little bit about how soldiers were compensated and perhaps why a person might want to join the Roman military. What you don't know yet is who these people were. And we have some great source material that tells us about the lives of soldiers. We have surviving structures that give us a sense of the places they lived, the kinds of climates, the gods they worshipped, and their quality of life. And that's what we're going to talk about on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.